Hey guys, tonight we trudge straight into the glow of a medieval forge, where sparks jump like fireflies and the air tastes faintly of iron and smoke. You're standing there right now, shoulders already warm, eyes squinting as the bellows wheeze and the anvil rings out in a way that feels like it's vibrating your teeth. This is not the cozy, candlelit Middle Ages of storybooks. This is heat that presses against your face, noise that never quite stops, and work that begins before your body feels ready for it. You probably won't survive this. At least not with your modern expectations of comfort, safety, or weekends intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and livelihoods. And while you're settling in, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere out there it's 2 and you're listening to a blacksmith's forge instead of sensible sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a medieval blacksmith, and the first thing you notice is that your world is loud, not city traffic, loud, but rhythmic, relentless loud. Hammer on anvil again and again, a sound so constant that villagers can tell the time of day by it. That's a mainstream historical fact. By the way, in many medieval villages, the blacksmith's hammering acted like an unofficial clock. Somewhere between your 5th and 600th strike of the morning, you stop hearing it as noise and start hearing it as life itself. If silence ever comes, it's usually a bad sign. Either you're sick, the forge is cold, or something has gone terribly wrong. Fun times. The forge itself is a small, dark structure, often separate from homes because, surprise, open flames and thatched roofs don't mix well. You work surrounded by soot-stained walls and tools that look simple but are anything but. The heat is constant, even in winter, which sounds nice until you remember you're wearing heavy wool and leather. Medieval people didn't exactly have moisture-wicking fabrics. You sweat, you wipe your face, you sweat again. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you wonder why you didn't choose a nice, quiet career like medieval plague doctor. Joke 1. Consider it a warm-up. Unlike you, who are very warm already, your day starts early, dawn usually, sometimes before. The fire must be coaxed awake, just like you, except it responds better to encouragement. Charcoal is precious, iron even more so. Every spark that jumps too far feels like wasted money. Historians still argue whether most medieval blacksmiths specialized early on or remained generalists out of necessity. But either way, you're expected to do everything: horseshoes, nails, hinges, plow parts, cooking implements, and the occasional sword if you're unlucky enough to live near conflict. And yes, unlucky is the right word, because being good at your job means everyone knows where to find you. Your forge is a hub, a place of noise and necessity. Villagers drift in and out, bringing broken tools, gossip, and expectations. There's always an undertone of urgency. A farmer needs a repaired plow before planting season ends. A traveler needs a wagon wheel rimmed before nightfall. You learn quickly that just one more thing is medieval code for cancel your plans forever. Joke 2. Your medieval work-life balance is mostly work, with a light garnish of life. You stand close to the fire, managing it carefully. This isn't just brute force, it's knowledge passed down through generations. Bellows control oxygen, oxygen controls heat, controls whether iron becomes workable or useless slag. A quirky but true tidbit: some medieval smiths believed certain days were better for forging than others, tied to planetary hours or saints' feast days. Even practical hedged their bets when molten metal is involved. You might not believe it fully, but you also don't forge on sea. Lawrence's day without saying a little prayer. Can't hurt, right? Your body already feels different. Blacksmiths were famously strong, but that strength comes at a cost. Even in your first years, your hands thicken, your shoulders knot, your hearing dulls slightly from constant ringing. There's no concept of ergonomic design here. The anvil height is what it is, and your back will adapt or complain quietly for the rest of your life. Archaeological studies of blacksmith skeletons show asymmetric muscle development and joint wear, which is a polite academic way of saying this job wrecks you. You pause only briefly to drink water or small beer, more often than not, because it's safer than water and, honestly, because it's there. The forge smells like smoke, hot metal and leather. That smell sticks to you. You carry it home. You carry it into church. You are, unmistakably, the blacksmith. Joke 3: medieval deodorant is just acceptance. There's pride here, though. Real pride. Iron is the backbone of medieval life and you shape it. Without you, fields go unplowed, horses go unshod, doors don't close, and weapons don't exist. You're not noble, but you're respected and slightly feared. Fire and metal feel close to magic when most people can't read. Some villagers cross themselves when they pass your forge, just in case. Others bring small offerings, hoping you'll prioritize their work. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were viewed more as craftsmen or as liminal figures bordering on the supernatural. But standing here, you can feel both judgments resting on your shoulders. As night approaches, the fire finally dims, your arms achy in a deep, heavy way that promises to be there again tomorrow. You step outside, ears ringing, eyes adjusting to the softer light. The forge cools behind you, ticking and cracking as metal contracts. This is only the beginning. You've survived your entrance into the blacksmith's life. For now. Tomorrow, the hammer starts again. You wake before you're ready, because the village wakes before you're ready. Even if the sun is barely considering the horizon, someone is already outside your door, shifting their weight, clearing their throat, reminding you that the world runs on iron and you are the one who bends it into shape. There is no formal opening hour. The forge opens when you do, and if you don't, people notice. The village needs you constantly in ways that feel flattering for about 5 minutes and then quietly exhausting forever. By the time the fire is alive again, the requests begin to stack up in your head like unfinished chores. A farmer needs nails for a fence because a cow escaped. Another needs a plowshare reforged before the soil dries too much. A widow brings a cracked cooking hook and looks apologetic for even asking, which somehow makes it harder to say no. This is a mainstream historical reality. Blacksmiths were central service providers in medieval communities, often serving dozens or even hundreds of people spread across surrounding farms. You don't just make things. You keep daily life functional. There is no neat queue. People drift in, hover, talk. While you work, they watch. This is both normal and irritating. You are the medieval equivalent of a public Wi-Fi hotspotter. Everyone uses you. Few people understand how you work, and complaints are frequent when things don't happen instantly. You learn to nod while hammering, to grunt responses that could mean yes, no, or maybe later. Joke 1: it's the original multitasking minus the praise. Payment is flexible. Sometimes it's coins, which are nice and reassuringly solid. Often it's barter, eggs, grain, cheese, a promise of help during harvest. Barter keeps you fed, but it also keeps you mentally tolling who owes what. You become not just a craftsman, but an accountant with soot on your face. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were generally better off than peasants, but the answer depends heavily on how you measure better. You're less likely to starve outright, but more likely to be perpetually busy and quietly anxious. There's also urgency layered over everything. Medieval life runs on seasons, and iron tools are time-sensitive. Miss the planting window, and the entire year tilts toward hunger. When someone shows up desperate, you feel it in your chest. Their panic becomes your pressure. You can't rush iron. It heats when it heats, cools when it cools. But that doesn't stop people from hoping you'll bend physics out of kindness. Sometimes you do, sometimes you can't. Either way, you're remembered for it. The forge becomes a social center whether you want it to or not. News travels through your doorway. Who's sick, who's pregnant, who's fighting with whom. You learn more than you ever asked to know. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, blacksmiths were among the first villagers to hear traveling news because messengers and merchants needed repairs immediately. You hear about distant wars while fixing a hinge, about kings you'll never see while shaping a horseshoe. The world arrives in fragments, smelling faintly of road dust and urgency. You notice that people talk differently around you. Some flatter you, calling your work strong or true, as if iron itself listens. Others tread carefully, half joking about curses or bad luck. Fire makes people nervous. The idea that you control it gives you an odd social gravity. Children stare. Adults pretend not to. And livelihoods. You're the medieval version of "don't annoy the IT guy." The demands don't stop at sundown. Someone always needs something urgently repaired before morning. A horse threw a shoe. A cart broke an axle peg. Emergencies ignore your fatigue. You weigh each request carefully, because saying yes means another hour of heat and strain, but saying no means consequences for someone else. This is where the jobs sinks into you, heavy and unavoidable. You can't truly clock out. The forge may go dark, but responsibility doesn't. Your body feels the accumulation. Not dramatic injury, just constant wear. Hands stiffen when they cool. Shoulders burn dully. You eat more than most, because you burn calories like a small furnace. There's a historical consensus on this, pointing blacksmiths required high-calorie diets to sustain their labor, often consuming more bread and protein than average villagers. It helps, but it doesn't fix everything. Sleep comes fast and deep, but never quite long enough. Occasionally, you think about what happens if you stop, if you get sick, if your arm fails. The village would scramble. Someone might travel miles to find another smith. Work would pile up. Life would slow and fray at the edges. That knowledge is empowering and unsettling. You matter, and you're replaceable, just not easily. As the day finally fades, you close the forge again, aware that tomorrow will look almost exactly the same. The needs will return. The hammer will rise. The anvil will answer. You don't dream of glory. You dream of quiet moments between sparks and livelihoods, when no one is asking for anything and the iron behaves itself. They're rare, but you learn to treasure them. You didn't choose this life the way modern people choose careers. It chose you first, quietly, years ago, when your hands were smaller and the anvil seemed impossibly tall. Apprenticeship begins early in the medieval world, often around the age of 7 or 8. And by the time you're old enough to question it, you're already in too deep to imagine anything else. Childhood, as you understand it now, is mostly a rumor you hear from people who never stood this close to fire. As an apprentice, you start with the boring parts. No heroic hammering, no dramatic showers of sparks. You sweep, you fetch water, you pump bellows until your arms feel like they're filled with wet sand. This is a mainstream historical factor. Most blacksmith apprentices spent years doing menial labor before being trusted with real forging. The logic is simple. Iron is expensive, mistakes are costly, and masters prefer not to gamble on untrained hands. You learn patience the hard way, one endless bellow shift at a time. Your master is not cruel, exactly, but not gentle either. Medieval discipline is practical. If you mess up, you're corrected quickly and memorably, not always with violence, sometimes with words sharp enough to stick. Praise is rare, which makes the occasional nod or grunt of approval feel like a small holiday. You watch everything. How he listens to the iron, how he judges heat by color, how he moves with efficiency born of repetition. Historians still argue whether medieval apprenticeship was exploitive or mutually beneficial. But standing here, sore and young, it feels like both. Your education is mostly physical. Reading and writing are luxuries, not requirements. Your hands learn before your mind does. You memorize weight, resistance, sound. You learn that iron speaks in dull reds and bright yellows, that too cold means cracks and too hot means ruin. A quirky tidbit. Some apprentices were taught to recognize forging temperatures using rhymes or songs tied to color. because it was easier to remember musically than technically. It's medieval ASMR, except instead of whispering, it's yelling over a fire. You grow fast. Not taller, necessarily, but denser. Your shoulders broaden, your grip strengthens, your palms harden into something that barely feels pain anymore. Other children your age are herding animals or helping in fields, but your labor is indoors and intense. Joke 1. You skip the awkward teenage phase and go straight to perpetually sore adult. There's very little room for rebellion. Running away is theoretically possible, but practically risky. You have no money, no trade beyond half-learned skills, and no guarantee another master would take you. Guild rules, where they exist, often bind apprentices formally for a set number of years. Breaking that contract can mean fines or legal trouble. You stay, because staying is safer than uncertainty. Despite everything, there are moments of quiet pride. The first time you're allowed to shape a simple nail, the first hook that doesn't bend wrong. These are tiny victories, but they feel enormous. You begin to understand that blacksmithing is less about strength and consistency. Anyone can hit iron hard. Not everyone can hit it right every time. Joke 2. Turns out, just hit it harder is not a sustainable life philosophy. You also learn the social side of the forge early, how to speak respectfully to customers, how to listen without promising too much, how to stay silent when adults argue politics over your head. You are present but invisible, expected to absorb everything and comment on nothing. This invisibility is training in itself. It teaches you observation, restraint, and the art of staying out of trouble. In the evenings when the forge cools, you sometimes sleep nearby, curled up on straw. Home and workplace blur together. The smell of smoke becomes comforting. Silence feels wrong. When you dream, it's often of hammering, steady, endless, soothing in a strange way. Historians still argue whether medieval children perceived labor as hardship or normality, but for you, this is simply life. There's nothing to compare it to. Years pass like this, marked by muscle growth and skill accumulation rather than birthdays. Eventually, the master steps back more often. You step forward. One day, without ceremony, you realize you're doing real work. Useful work. Work people rely on. It's not freedom exactly, but it's progress. You've survived apprenticeship. You're no longer just pumping bellows. You're shaping iron, and yourself, into something that might endure. By now, your days are ruled by objects that talk but somehow still give orders. The hammer waits where you left it, the anvil sits solid and unmoving, and the bellows loom like a breathing animal that needs constant attention. These tools aren't accessories to your work. They are your work. Each one sets the pace of your life, quietly deciding how fast you move and how long you last. The hammer comes first, not just one, but several, each with a slightly different weight and balance. You choose them the way a musician chooses instruments, though no would ever describe your forge as melodic. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmiths often owned a range of specialized hammers, from light planishing hammers to heavy sledges, tailored to specific tasks. Your hands know which one to reach for without thinking. Pick the wrong one, and your arm tells you immediately. Joke 1. It's like choosing the wrong pillow, except the pillow fights back. The anvil is the heart of everything. Heavy, expensive, and often passed down or acquired with great effort. It's the one thing you would save if the forge burned. Anvils in the medieval period weren't all identical. Many were simpler blocks of iron, sometimes set into wooden stumps. The shape determines what you can do. Horns for bending, flat faces for shaping, edges for cutting. You learn every nick and imperfection, adjusting your blows instinctively. There's a strange intimacy to it, standing in the same spot day after day, hands moving over the same scarred surface. Then there are the bellows. They are less glamorous, but they control everything. Without air, the fire sulks. With too much, it rages. Bellows work is tiring and often delegated to apprentices, but you still understand it deeply. You listen to the fire's response, the subtle change in raw that tells you it's ready. A quirky tidbitting. Some medieval bellows were decorated or carved even though they spent their lives covered in soot. Apparently, if you're going to sweat over something daily, you might as well make it look nice. Tongs hang nearby, each shaped for a specific grip. Flat jaws, round jaws, wolf jaw tong. You don't grab iron barehanded unless you're testing how much pain you can tolerate today. Even then, you regret it instantly. Tools are arranged by habit, not logic. Move one, and you feel disoriented. Historians still argue whether medieval workshops were deliberately organized or simply evolved organically. But your forge feels like a memory palace made of iron and ash. These tools dictate your posture too. You stand where the anvil allows, swing where the hammer demands. Over time, your body adapts in subtle, permanent ways. Your dominant arm grows thicker. Your stance widens. Your spine curves slightly forward. Archaeologists have identified blacksmiths by skeletal markers alone, which is both impressive and mildly unsettling. Joke twok. Even in death, your run summon is extremely clear. Maintenance never ends. Tools wear out. Handles crack. Faces chip. You spend time repairing the things that make your work possible. A loop of labor that never quite closes. There's no hardware store. No quick replacement. If something breaks, you fix it or you go without. This breeds a certain self-reliance that borders on stubbornness. You trust what you've made more than anything else. The forge fire itself is a tool, though a temperamental one. You adjust charcoal, airflow, and placement constantly. The fire teaches patience. Rush it, and it punishes you with ruined metal. Ignore it, and it dies. There's a rhythm to it. A steady cycle of heat and strike that becomes almost meditative. Modern mindfulness apps would have a field day with this if they didn't mind the sparks. Joke 3 inhale, exalic dodge the flying slag. Every day these tools quietly shape not just iron but you. They decide when you rest, when you push, when you stop. You don't think about them as separate anymore. They are extensions of your hands, your arms, your will. When you finally set the hammer down at night, your muscles still remember its weight. Even in sleep, you feel the echo of its rhythm, steady and unyielding, waiting to begin again. You learn quickly that fire is never neutral. It is helpful, dangerous, moody, and always watching for the moment you stop paying attention. Managing it becomes less about dominance and more about negotiation, a daily conversation between you and something that could ruin everything if it feels ignored. You feed it charcoal, you give it air, you pull back just before it gets greedy. Fire, like people, behaves best when it feels respected. This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's practical survival. Medieval forges regularly burned down, sometimes taking nearby buildings with them. That's a mainstream historical fact, and one reason blacksmith shops were often built slightly apart from homes. You live with the knowledge that one stray spark could undo years of work, so you watch constantly. You sweep embers. You keep water close. You don't turn your back for long. Joke 1, congratulations. You've invented anxiety before it had a name. Alongside technique comes belief. Fire invites superstition the way darkness invites stories. You hear them all. Never forge on certain saints' days. Never let a woman in labor pass the forge door. Never whistle near the fire because it attracts bad luck. Some of these rules contradict each other, but that doesn't stop people from following all of them just in case. A quirky tidbit in parts of medieval Europe. Blacksmiths were believed to have power over spirits because iron was thought to repel supernatural beings. You may not fully believe it, but when the night is quiet and the forge pops and hisses on its own, you don't argue either. You develop rituals of your own. Not formal prayers necessarily, but habits that feel necessary. Lighting the fire the same way each morning. Tapping the anvil before starting work. Saying nothing for the first few minutes, letting the forge wake up. Historians still argue whether these behaviors were conscious superstition or simple routine, but for you, the distinction doesn't matter. They help, that's enough. Fire also teaches you humility. Some days it behaves beautifully, heating iron evenly, responding exactly as expected. Other days it sulks or flares unpredictably, and you adjust your plans accordingly. You learn not to fight it. Forcing iron when the fire isn't right only wastes material and energy. This lesson seeps outward into the rest of your life. You stop rushing what can't be rushed. You accept delays. You swear less at inanimate objects, though not never. Joke 2. You swear, just more creatively now. Heat management becomes second nature. You judge temperature by color, by sound, by feel radiating against your skin. There are no thermometers, no safety cutoffs. Your senses are your instruments. This sensory fluency is so deep that you don't realize how rare it is until someone else steps too close to the forge and flinches. You forget how intimidating it looks from the outside. The village watches your relationship with fire carefully. Children are warned away. Adults keep a respectful distance. Fire is necessary, but it's also blamed when things go wrong. If a crop fails or illness spreads, whispers sometimes drift toward the forge. You feel it occasionally, the subtle shift in tone, the jokes that aren't quite jokes. Joke 3. It's amazing how quickly essential worker turns in suspicious guy with flames. Still, you keep the fire alive. Day after day, season after season. You understand it better than most, even if it never truly belongs to you. When you finally bank the coals at night, covering them so they'll smolder until morning, there's a quiet satisfaction. The fire sleeps because you allow it to. Tomorrow you'll wake it again, cautiously, respectfully, and just a little superstitiously. By now, your body is no longer just something you live in. It's a tool that shows where the way your hammer does. The toll of hammering settles into you gradually, so gradually that you don't notice it until someone younger steps in the forge and winces after an hour. You remember doing that once. It feels like it happened to someone else. Your day is built from repeated motions. Lift, swing, strike, turn the iron. Lift, swing, strike again. This repetition shapes you. A mainstream historical fact. Skeletal remains of medieval blacksmiths often show enlarged muscle attachment points and uneven bone development, especially in the arms and shoulders. Your dominant arm grows thicker and stronger, while the other lags just enough to remind you that balance was never part of the job description. Joke 1. You are extremely fit as long as no one asks you to do yoga. Your hands are a map of your life. Calluses overlap old burns. Small scars fade into newer ones. You don't react much to minor pain anymore, which sounds impressive until you realize it also means you sometimes don't notice injuries until they're inconvenient. A spark lands on your skin, and you brush it off out of habit. Later, you'll find the blister and vaguely remember when it happened. Pain becomes background noise, like the ringing in your ears. Your hearing changes too. The constant ring of iron on iron dulls it over time. There's no ear protection, no awareness that this might be a problem later. You just learn to ask people to repeat themselves. Historians still argue whether hearing loss was widespread among blacksmiths or simply underreported, but standing here, straining slightly to catch a customer's words, you suspect the answer leans toward yes. Your back carries a quiet H that never fully leaves. The anvil height dictates your posture, and your posture dictates your spine. You lean forward, always forward, even when you're not working. Your body seems ready to strike iron. At night, when you lie down, there's a brief moment where everything lines up just right and the H fades. You chase that moment like a reward. Despite this, you are undeniably strong. Not showy strength, not the kind that draws cheers, but functional strength. You can lift, drag, twist, and hold things most people can't. Villagers notice. They ask for help moving stones, straightening beams, bending stubborn metal back into shape. You rarely say no, partly because you can, and partly because it reinforces your place in the community. Joke 2. You are everyone's favorite friend when furniture needs moving. You also age differently. Years of heat and strain carve lines into your face early. You look older than you are. This is common enough that people expect it. A blacksmith with a smooth face would seem suspicious, like a baker without flour on his hands. The forge leaves its mark, and no one doubts where you've been. You develop coping strategies. You stretch without calling it stretching. You shift your stance to spare a knee. You swap hands when you can, even if it feels awkward. These small adjustments are survival, not comfort. A quirky tidbit: some medieval smiths were rumored to soak their hands in warm animal fat at night to ease stiffness. It may or may not help, but the ritual itself brings relief, and sometimes that's enough. When illness hits, it hits harder. You can't work lightly. There is no easy day at the forge. If you're too sick to swing a hammer, you're too sick to work at all. This scares you more than pain ever did. Your body is your livelihood, and every twinge carries that knowledge with it. Still, you return each morning. You wrap sore hands around familiar tools. You feel the H fade into motion. The hammer rises. The anvil answers. Your body complains, but it also remembers what to do. For now, it still holds together. And in a life measured by endurance, that counts as success. Money, in your world, is never just money. It's iron weighed against effort, effort weighed against time, and time weighed against how tired you already are. The economics of blacksmithing settle over you like a low, constant hum. Always there, rarely loud, and livelihoods, but impossible to ignore. You don't count wealth in piles of coins so much as in whether the charcoal bin is full and the pantry isn't empty. Iron itself is expensive. Not gold expensive, but precious enough that waste feels like a personal failure. A mainstream historical fact: medieval iron production was limited by access to or fuel and labor, making worked iron a valuable commodity in most regions. Every missed strike that ruins a piece stings twice. Once in pride, once in lost resources. You learn to be careful not because you're gentle, but because carelessness is unaffordable. Payment arrives in many forms. Coins, yes, but also grain, meat, ale, cloth, labor. Barter keeps the village interconnected, but it also tangles you in obligations. Someone pays you in future promises, and you have to trust they'll remember. And livelihoods, they don't. Sometimes they can't. You learn which debts to chase and which to quietly forgive. Historians still argue whether medieval village economies were primarily cash-based or barter-driven, but from where you stand, it feels like a messy blend that requires constant mental bookkeeping. Debt is a shadow that follows you. You may be owed plenty, but you also owe. Charcoal burners or suppliers, landlords, guild fees if you're in a town. Cash flow, to use a very modern term, is unpredictable. One slow season can tighten everything. Winter especially tests you. Work slows, but mouths still need feeding. Joke 1. Budgeting is harder when your spreadsheet is just anxiety and hope. You price your work carefully. Too high, and people complain or go elsewhere. Too low, and you exhaust yourself for nothing. There's social pressure to be fair, which often means generous. You can't easily refuse a neighbor in need without risking your reputation. Reputation is currency here, just harder to count. A single accusation of cheating or shoddy work can haunt you longer than any unpaid debt. Sometimes you extend credit because the alternative feels worse. A farmer without a plowshare can't plant. A village without planted fields doesn't eat. You tell yourself it will come back around, and often it does. Sometimes it doesn't. You carry those losses quietly, absorbing them into the cost of being essential. You notice patterns over time. Weddings bring work, new locks, tools, household items. Funerals too, in a quieter way. Harvest seasons are busy, so are military campaigns, when suddenly everyone wants weapons repaired or reshaped. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval towns, blacksmiths were temporarily forbidden from overcharging during emergencies, an early form of price control that rarely accounted for your exhaustion. Savings, such as they are, take solid form: extra tools, spare iron, charcoal tucked away. These are your safety net. Coins can be stolen, Iron is harder to take unnoticed. You invest in durability, not luxury. When you do buy something purely for comfort, it feels strange, almost irresponsible. There's always the fear of one bad year, a fire injury, a war that bypasses your village instead of feeding it work. You plan as much as you can, but so much remains out of your control. This uncertainty hums beneath your daily routine, shaping decisions in ways you don't always articulate. Yet, you persist. You balance generosity with caution. You learn when to say no, even when it's uncomfortable. You accept that some effort will never be fully repaid. The forge doesn't make you rich, but it keeps you afloat. In a world where that's not guaranteed, survival itself becomes profit enough. Rules begin to press in on you more noticeably now, not as dramatic proclamations, but as quiet boundaries you learn not to cross. Guilds, where they exist, are the invisible architecture of your working life. In towns and cities especially, they decide who may work, how much can be charged, and what quality is considered acceptable. Out in rural areas, things are looser, but the influence still seeps in like smoke under a door. A mainstream historical fact: medieval craft guilds regulated training, production standards, and competition, often claiming to protect both craftsmen and customers. As a blacksmith, this can be a blessing or a slow irritation, depending on the day. Guild membership can offer protection from unfair accusations, access to shared resources, and a sense of belonging. It can also mean fees, inspections, and being told how many apprentices you're allowed to have. Joke 1. Nothing says independent craftsman like a committee deciding your hammering schedule. Guild rules shape your path early. They formalize apprenticeship lengths, outline expectations, and define when apprentice becomes a journeyman. Advancement isn't just about skill, it's about approval. Someone has to say you're ready. Historians still argue whether guilds primarily empowered craftsmen or restricted innovation, but from your perspective, they feel like both a shield and a leash. Politics creep in quietly. Rival smiths watch each other, not openly hostile but alert. If someone undercuts prices too aggressively or produces shoddy work, complaints find their way to guild elders, meetings happen. Decisions are made behind closed doors. You learn that reputation matters as much inside the guild as outside it. Say the wrong thing, or offend the wrong person, and opportunities narrow. There are also local laws to consider. Town councils may regulate fire use, noise, or working hours. Night forging can be frowned upon, even if emergencies don't respect curfews. You negotiate constantly between what needs doing and what is permitted. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval cities, blacksmiths were required to keep buckets of water outside their forges at all times, a simple rule that likely saved countless buildings and a few lives. Power dynamics are subtle but ever-present. Wealthier patrons expect priority. Officials expect compliance. Clergy may expect discounts, framed as goodwill. You weigh each interaction carefully. Open defiance rarely ends well, but quiet firmness earns respect. This balancing act becomes second nature, a kind of social hammering that shapes your standing over time. Guild gatherings are strange affairs, part business, part ritual, part social theater. You stand among others who smell like smoke and metal, listening to discussions about standards and disputes. There's camaraderie here, a shared understanding that no one else quite gets what you do. There's also tension, because everyone wants enough work to survive. Joke 2. It's networking, medieval style, with fewer business cards and more beards. Outside the guild hall, villagers often assume you have more power than you do. They think you can bend rules at will, pull strings, make exceptions. Sometimes you can. Often you can't. Explaining that you are constrained by regulations sounds like excuse-making, so you rarely bother. You just do what you can and absorb the rest. Over time, you internalize the rules so deeply they feel natural. You know what's acceptable without checking. You know which lines not to cross. This quiet compliance keeps your work flowing and your life relatively stable. It's not freedom, but it's structure, And in a chaotic world, structure has its comforts. As you close the forge at the end of another regulated day, you reflect that iron isn't the only thing shaped here. Laws, guilds, and quiet politics have been shaping you too, hammering rough independence into something that fits the larger frame. You don't always like it, but you survive within it, and survival remains the unspoken goal. When the forge door closes and the hammer finally rests, you expect quiet. Sometimes you get it, and livelihoods. More often you get something stranger, isolation that hums just as loudly as the anvil ever did. Rural blacksmithing places you at the edge of things, central to village life yet slightly apart from it. People come to you all day, but few stay once their needs are met. Your forge sits a little removed, for safety and for smell. That distance grows symbolic. You hear laughter from the tavern, bells from the church, arguments from the square, but you're rarely in the middle of them. This is a mainstream historical reality. Many medieval blacksmiths worked on the outskirts of settlements, both to reduce fire risk and because of noise. Proximity keeps you useful. Distance keeps you alone. Loneliness isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It arrives in the evening, when your hands finally stop moving and there's nothing left to distract you. You eat, you rest, you listen. The village settles into itself without you. When you do join social gatherings, people often talk around you instead of with you, as if unsure where to place someone who spends all day commanding fire. Joke one, you are invited everywhere and fully included almost nowhere. Rumors travel faster than reason. Because you hear so much, people assume you say a lot. Because you work with iron, people assume you know secrets. If something goes wrong, a failed harvest, a sudden illness, someone eventually wonders aloud if the forge has something to do with it. Not loudly, just enough for the idea to linger. A quirky tidbiting. In some medieval folklore, blacksmiths were thought capable of forging not just tools, but fate itself. You didn't sign up for that responsibility, but it clings anyway. You learn to keep your opinions close, to listen more than you speak. Information is currency, and gossip is sharp. One careless comment can echo longer than a hammer strike. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were truly marginalized or simply perceived as other due to their work. But the difference feels academic when you're standing on the edge of a conversation that started without you. Still, isolation has its advantages. You're less entangled in petty disputes. You're trusted with confidences precisely because you don't spread them. People vent while you work, assuming the noise swallows their words. Often, it does. You become a quiet witness to village life, observing patterns others miss. Children sometimes linger, watching from a distance. They're curious, a little afraid. You soften for them, explaining sparks and tools in simple terms. This helps. It reminds people you're human, not a walking omen. Joke 2, Public Relations, Medieval Edition, powered by explaining hammers. At night, rumors fade into background noise, replaced by crickets and cooling metal. The forge ticks softly as it settles, a sound you've come to find comforting. You remind yourself that usefulness is a kind of belonging, even if it feels different from warmth. You are alone, yes, but you are needed. And in this world, that often has to be enough. Danger, unlike isolation, doesn't announce itself politely. It waits in shadows, in stray sparks, in misplaced bellows, in the slight wobble of a hammer swing. You live with it constantly, because blacksmithing is inherently risky. You know it from day one, but understanding it fully comes slowly, when your fingers are blistered, your arms achy, and you almost trip over a hot iron rod. The forge is unforgiving, and it doesn't negotiate. Accidents are frequent and not always dramatic. You nick a thumb, a piece of iron snaps, a wheel rim twists unexpectedly. These are the everyday dangers, the kind that leave marks but rarely make headlines. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmiths had one of the highest rates of occupational injuries in villages, mostly minor but cumulatively significant. Over time, these small harms accumulate into chronic pain or subtle deformities. Joke 1, it's basically a lifetime subscription to Wouch. That hurts. Then there's the rare but serious accident. Sparks ignite straw nearby, charcoal barrels catch flame, a hammer slips, clanging against bone. Everyone knows someone who lost a finger or an eye or worse. You carry that knowledge like a shadow across your shoulders. You take precautions, yes, but even caution only reduces, not eliminates, the risk. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were inherently reckless or simply unlucky. But standing here with your singed hair and slightly scorched tunic, you understand how quickly routine can become dangerous. Fire, of course, is the first hazard. It burns, it smokes, it flares unpredictably. You measure it constantly, adjusting airflow, shoveling coals, and never turning your back. Heat exhaustion is real, especially in summer, and there is no air conditioning or modern cooling. You drink small beer or water, trying to stay hydrated, though neither is perfect. Every day is a balance between pushing the metal and not pushing yourself too far. Joke 2, think of it as medieval interval training. Only the intervals threaten life and limb. Flying sparks are deceptively gentle. Most don't hurt, but one miscalculated bounce can ignite clothing or start a small fire. You notice the patterning sparks tend to travel in arcs that the eye can't always predict. Experience teaches you to anticipate them. Safety isn't just habit, it's instinct. The same goes for heavy iron. Miss a grip and it falls on a foot or knee. Tongs are your first line of defense, but they don't prevent every mishap. Blisters and burns are constant companions. You treat them as best you can, sometimes with medicinal herbs, sometimes with nothing at all. A quirky tidbit, some blacksmiths believed rubbing crushed garlic or ashes on burns could speed healing. You don't entirely trust it, but hey, anything that might work is worth a try. The important thing is survival. Pain is inconvenient, infection is fatal, sharp edges, sudden snaps, and the recoil of metal under hammering are all part of the learning curve. You learn to respect the weight and unpredictability of what you handle. A sword, tang, a horseshoe, a plowshare, each has its quirks. Forget them, and injury is inevitable. Mistakes are expensive, literally and physically. That tension hums beneath every movement, sharpening awareness the way fire sharpens iron. Even the forge itself is a hazard. Chimneys can smoke back, bellows can misfire, floors can slick with water or oil. Each day is a sequence of calculations, some conscious, some instinctive. You survive by observing, by anticipating, by respecting the tools, the fire, and your own limits. This isn't heroism. It's pragmatic endurance, a life lived at the edge of attention, where a moment's carelessness can ripple through hours of labor. By the end of the day, when your hammer rests, your muscles are tired in ways that remind you of every near miss, every minor disaster you've avoided. You breathe a little easier, knowing you've made it through another cycle of sparks, noise, and potential catastrophe. Danger doesn't leave. It simply waits for tomorrow. But for tonight, it's quiet, and that alone feels like a small blessing. You're used to iron, but not everything you handle is predictable. Materials beyond plain iron sometimes arrive at your forge, and each one stretches your skill in ways you didn't ask for. Bronze, copper, even occasional bits of precious metal, each has its quirks. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmiths occasionally worked with alloys or repurposed metals, though most of their daily labor involved straightforward iron. The unexpected pieces challenge your rhythm, forcing adjustments in heat, hammering technique, and patience. Sometimes you receive stone or bone to fashion simple tools or decorative elements. You're careful because, unlike iron, these materials crack more easily. Tactile sensitivity becomes critical. You strike too hard and the work is ruined. Strike too softly and it doesn't hold its shape. This constant negotiation with unfamiliar materials teaches flexibility. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, blacksmiths were asked to engrave bits of meteorite into ceremonial items, believed to carry magical properties. Whether the villagers believed it or just wanted a showpiece, it tested your patience and your creativity. Learning to work with these substances also exposes you to scholarly debates of your time. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were innovators by necessity or simply experimental because they had spare materials to tinker with. Either way, you begin to notice patterns in how different metals behave under heat and pressure. Bronze bends differently than iron. Copper cracks differently. Small adjustments, repeated hundreds of times, become second nature. Adapting tools for these materials is another challenge. Your hammers, tongs, and anvils were designed primarily for iron. You improvise, creating makeshift setups or adjusting your grip. Each success reinforces your confidence. Each failure, though frustrating, teaches a lesson. Joke 1. It's like solving a puzzle with molten pieces that scream at you if you guess wrong. The unpredictability of material extends to size and shape. Sometimes a customer brings a chunk of metal that isn't what they said it would be. You have to make do, reshaping it or adding pieces to create something functional. You learn that blacksmithing is often improvisation disguised as routine labor. Creativity becomes survival, even if your main concern is durability over beauty. You start to read the metal as you might read a conversation. It hums, glows, reacts to pressure. You anticipate its resistance. You listen for subtle changes in sound or color. Metals almost speak to you if you pay attention, whispering warnings, corrections, and praise. This intimacy builds a kind of trust, unusual for labor, where usually only sweat and exhaustion dominate. Learning to work with unusual metals also enhances your reputation. Patrons notice when you handle difficult materials with skill. Occasionally, rare commissions arriving ceremonial objects, decorative hinges, symbolic gifts. These are small breaks from daily drudgery, but they matter. They remind you that the hammer doesn't always dictate monotony. You can shape elegance as well as necessity. Joke 2. Elegance with a side of soot and back pain. Ultimately, each new material teaches patience, precision, and respect. Iron is your bread and butter, predictable and reliable. Everything else forces thought and adaptation. You walk the line between tradition and experimentation, learning that even the simplest blacksmith's life contains unexpected lessons if you're alert enough to notice them. War comes to your door in subtle ways. You may not march with an army, but the weapons you shape, swords, spears, armor, are intimately tied to conflict, a mainstream historical facting. Blacksmiths were essential to medieval warfare, often providing and repairing arms for local militias or knights. Your forge hums with the quiet weight of responsibility. Every strike on a sword tang feels like a small act in a much larger, sometimes terrifying, game. You don't always feel heroic. Most of the time, you're just doing your job. A local lord demands a repaired halberd. A neighboring village requests sharpened pikes. You shape the steel, sweat dripping onto the forge floor, thinking only of proper temper and balance. Joke 1. You don't ask questions. You just pretend the war is happening elsewhere. Mental distance is survival. There's an ethical shadow, though, and livelihoods. You know the weapons you make may be used against someone you know, or someone you might never meet. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths bore moral responsibility for the tools they provided. In practice, this debate is abstract. Your hands obey the forge. They do not judge the battles. Yet sometimes at night, the thought drifts, could a nail you forget ever change the course of a fight? Could your work inadvertently decide life or death? A quiet weight rests in your chest. The demand of war also accelerates production and changes priorities. Emergency orders mean long hours, sometimes at night. You work feverishly to repair armor dents, reshape sword edges, or forge spearheads. Heat and exhaustion blur into one another. Each hammer strike is urgent, and the stress tangibly warps the rhythm of the day. A quirky tidbit: some blacksmiths were known to create practice swords for training that were intentionally soft, allowing recruits to learn without injuring themselves. A small mercy in a dangerous world. You notice patterns in conflict work. Lords want reliability more than artistry. Peasants need weapons to protect their homes. Sometimes these demands conflict. You make adjustments, compromise, and learn quickly. Your forge becomes a node in a network you can't fully see, where each finished weapon might ripple outward in ways you'll never witness. Despite the pressure, there's pride. Few can shape iron as consistently and quickly as you. The fact that your work can serve critical purposes, defense, survival, even ceremonial roles, gives you a sense of purpose beyond daily chores. It's a strange mix. You wield power without leaving the forge, influence outcomes without ever seeing them unfold. Joke 2, the ultimate, remote work, medieval edition. But danger is never theoretical. A mistempered blade can shatter in use. Poorly repaired armor can fail at the wrong moment. Each mistake could be fatal. You double-check, triple-check, sweat through every minute of preparation. In these moments, your hands know far more than your mind does. Muscle memory guides precision, while conscious thought stays cautious. War shapes your identity quietly. You are indispensable yet peripheral. You produce objects that can kill or protect, but rarely wield them yourself. Your forge becomes a place where ethics, skill, and necessity collide. By the time the last order is delivered, you understand that this labor, like your body and tools, is a medium through which the broader chaos of the world passes, and somehow you continue to endure. While weapons and tools dominate the forge, life beyond the anvil quietly shapes your days too. Families contribute in ways that often go unnoticed. Women, siblings, and even children become part of the extended operation, helping haul coal, mix fuels, fetch water, or prepare simple meals. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval blacksmithing households often functioned as semi-industrial units, with multiple family members assisting in tasks that allowed the smith to focus on labor-intensive metalwork. You notice the rhythm of their help almost subconsciously, a silent choreography keeping the forge alive. It's not glamorous, but it matters. Without them, the workload becomes crushing. You feel grateful, though not always articulate about it. These helpers also absorb social expectations. They interact with villagers, manage small transactions, and serve as intermediaries for inquiries and minor complaints. You realize early that your work doesn't exist in isolation. It's embedded in family networks that both support and constrain you. Joke 1, you didn't realize that hiring staff in medieval times meant negotiating invisible union rules enforced by your mother and sister. Children growing up around the forge pick up skills informally. They watch, they imitate, they carry coals. Their presence is a kind of living training program. Some become apprentices, others simply retain the knowledge for their own survival. You notice patterns forming early: how to hold tongs, how to read a glowing piece of iron, how to gauge the subtle hiss when metal is ready. By the time they're capable, they have absorbed much of the craft without a single formal lesson. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, children were tasked with carrying cooled metal to nearby water sources for quenching, a responsibility both educational and risky. You cringe just thinking about it, but that's life. Families also carry the mental load of forge life. They absorb stress, immediate disputes, and smooth interactions with customers. Without their presence, your focus would fracture under the combined weight of labor, expectations, and fatigue. Historians still argue whether these household contributions were undervalued or simply overlooked. But from where you stand, they are indispensable. You rely on them constantly, even as you take pride in the visible labor. Beyond the practical, families bring stability. You know when meals will arrive. You know when someone is watching the forge for safety. You know when someone notices subtle shifts in your energy and can step in. This quiet support allows you to operate at peak efficiency, though it also reinforces dependence. You are never fully alone, but neither are you ever fully independent. Even relationships beyond the family matter. Marriages, friendships, alliances, all influence access to materials, customers, or local favor. You see how some smiths thrive because of connections more than skill, while others flounder despite talent. Social awareness becomes another tool in your kit, almost as essential as tongs or hammers. Joke 2 Diplomacy, Medieval Edition. Powered entirely by polite nods and occasional sighs, in the end the forge is not just yours. It's a household ecosystem, a social hub, a center of knowledge, and a site of continuous collaboration. You may wield the hammer, but others shape the conditions under which it strikes. Recognizing this is part of surviving and livelihoods, part of thriving, and part of understanding the subtle network of life that surrounds even the loudest anvil. The rhythm of your work is tied not just to fire or family, but to the calendar itself. Religion and ritual punctuate the year, setting limits and expectations that you cannot ignore. Sundays are sacred, yes, but feast days, saints' days, and holy observances create an intricate lattice of time that guides your labor. A mainstream historical fact, medieval blacksmiths often structured work around the ecclesiastical calendar, pausing for holy days, while adjusting schedules to accommodate seasonal workloads. You feel the tension between obligation and necessity constantly, like a bell that never stops ringing. Holy days bring relief and complication at once. On one hand, the forge can cool, you can rest, and the village slows. On the other, everyone expects work to be done before or after, often compressing tasks into shorter periods. Joke 1 Medieval Overtime was less about corporate policy and more about, if the saints are busy, so are you. You learn to read the calendar like you read iron, predicting behavior, planning work, and avoiding disaster. Ritual intersects with superstition in subtle ways. Lighting the fire might be accompanied by a quiet blessing, or a specific saint invoked for safety. Even a simple task, like hammering a new horseshoe, can be layered with tradition. A quirky tip: some regions held that forging iron on St. John's Day ensured protection against evil spirits for the entire year. You follow these rituals selectively, partly out of belief, partly out of habit, and partly because villagers notice deviations. Seasons dictate intensity. Planting and harvest schedules shift demand. Winter brings shorter days and slower work, but also harder metal. Cold iron is less forgiving. Summers stretch long, hot, and exhausting, testing endurance and hydration. Rain delays trips to the mine. Snow makes travel dangerous for deliveries. Historians still argue how much seasonal shifts actually influenced labor patterns, but from where you stand, the forge responds direct to nature's timetable, whether you like it or not. Feast days, oddly, are both reprieve and social theater. Villagers expect you to participate in celebrations, but they also expect the forge to remain functional for essential repairs. You negotiate, sometimes refusing politely, sometimes bending rules. Each decision affects reputation, trust, and workflow. You develop a mental ledger for every deviation, measuring consequences that could arrive months later. Religious observance also imposes moral boundaries. Certain contracts or commissions are deemed inappropriate for feast days, and refusing them is socially expected. You follow these rules more out of survival and conformity than devotion, though occasionally a genuine prayer slips through. Joke 2. Your mantra might be, "Please let this nail hold," whispered quietly while tapping at molten metal. Work weeks themselves feel arbitrary when measured against ritual. You might work non-stop for days if the calendar is crowded with seasonal demands, then suddenly stop for a 3-day feast. The abruptness is jarring. You learn patience, planning, and improvisation simultaneously. This rhythm seeps into your body, shaping expectations of pace and rest, hammering endurance and foresight into the same way iron is hammered into shape. By the end of the year, you notice patterns, traditions, and exceptions. They're embedded in your muscles and habits as much as they are in the village ledger. Religion, ritual, and routine shape not only your work but your perception of time. The forge itself becomes a quiet clock ticking in harmony with saints, seasons, and subtle superstitions, marking the passage of your life in rhythm with history itself. Weather is another invisible master in your forge life. Unlike modern workshops, you have no climate control. The chill of winter bites through leather gloves, the heat of summer presses relentlessly, and rain or snow can disrupt everything from deliveries to water for quenching. A mainstream historical fact: blacksmiths were highly attuned to seasonal conditions, often adjusting workflow to account for temperature, humidity, and available daylight. You notice every subtle change, because the iron reacts differently depending on the climate. Cold days are deceptively punishing. Iron refuses to bend easily, coal burns slower, and your muscles tighten before work even begins. You warm your hands over the fire, drink extra small beer, and adjust expectations. Joke 1: it's like the forge is playing favorites, giving easy days to no one. Even the simplest nails take longer, and impatience makes mistakes more likely. Heat, by contrast, is exhausting. Sweat pours constantly, soaking tunics and creating slippery floors. You drink water cautiously. Too much slows movement. Too little risks heat stroke. Flames flare unpredictably in hot air, and sparks jump farther than they do in winter. You've learned to anticipate this, adjusting bellows rhythm, coal placement, and distance from the anvil. The forge becomes a living system that you have to negotiate with constantly. A quirky tidbit: some blacksmiths would wet the forge floor slightly during summer to reduce dust and temperature, though it added another hazard for slipping. Rain is subtle but disruptive. Mud makes travel slow, water can damage wooden tools or create steam hazards, and deliveries arrive late. Snow is worse. It isolates you, makes transport treacherous, and forces long days to be compressed into fewer daylight hours. Historians still argue how much climate influenced blacksmith productivity, but anyone standing near a snowy anvil knows that it matters deeply. Wind brings unexpected problems too. A sudden gust can flare flames or blow smoke into your face. Sparks, which normally scatter predictably, take flight and threaten both body and workshop. You develop an instinctive awareness of drafts, adjusting bellows, coal, and placement of metal almost without thinking. This sensory adaptation becomes as vital as any learned hammer technique. Weather also shapes human behavior. Villagers come later in storms, earlier in fair weather. Requests become urgent after prolonged bad conditions. You notice these rhythms and factor them into daily planning, creating an invisible pattern of demand that parallels the forge's physical challenges. Over time, you learn to read subtle atmospheric signs. Clouds, wind shifts, and morning frost all signal what to expect at the forge. Your body adapts alongside the metal, conditioned to endure extremes that would make modern craftsmen flinch. By the time night falls and the forge cools, you're not just a blacksmith. You're a small weather station, attuned to every breeze, drizzle, and heat wave, bending your life rhythm to the natural world. Innovation in your world arrives slowly, like a reluctant visitor who might be polite, but isn't in any rush. Most tools and techniques have existed for generations, handed down from master to apprentice, rarely questioned, almost sacred in their continuity. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmithing saw technological changes, like water-powered hammers and improved bellows, but widespread adoption could take decades or longer. You notice incremental differences, subtle efficiencies, and occasional new methods, yet your daily rhythm remains mostly unchanged. Sometimes a new tool arrives, a different hammer shape, a specialized tong, a modified anvil design. It promises relief, maybe faster work or more precise shaping. At first you're skeptical. The old ways are reliable, predictable, and embedded into your muscles. Change feels like risk. You try, you adjust, you sometimes fail. Joke 1: modern engineers would call this beta testing. Except here the beta test can ruin dinner or twos. Some innovations are not technical but procedural. A guild may recommend a more efficient workflow or new apprenticeship method. You notice that older smiths grumble while younger ones experiment. Adaptation is both necessity and subtle social negotiation. Historians still argue whether these small innovations meaningfully improved productivity or simply shifted who bore the risk. You experience both faster work, but more opportunity for error until muscle memory catches up. Your environment resists sudden change. Forge layouts are fixed, fire behavior unpredictable, and villagers' expectations rigid. Even if a new technique would make life easier, it requires coordination. Training apprentices, ensuring materials are compatible, and avoiding upsetting established norms. Sometimes the old way is simply safer. A quirky tidbit: some smiths refused water-powered hammers because they claimed it angered the spirits of the forge. Blending superstition with inertia in a way that's hard to argue against when your livelihood is at stake. You do notice that even small shifts can ripple outward. A slightly more efficient bellows saves minutes on each task, which accumulate over the day. A new hammer weight reduces fatigue, letting you strike more consistently. These small innovations don't transform life, but they do smooth it, making exhaustion marginally more bearable. Joke 2: progress in your era feels like upgrading from a donkey cart to a slightly faster donkey cart. Some innovations fail spectacularly. A new alloy might crack unexpectedly. A tool might break in use. You absorb these lessons quietly, learning which experiments are worth repeating. Adaptation is part of your survival toolkit. You become observant, cautious, and sometimes creative, testing small improvements without jeopardizing essential production. Over time, innovation becomes less about novelty and more about subtle refinement. The anvil, the hammer, the bellows, they remain fundamentally unchanged, but your technique evolves. You learn to bend both metal and circumstance, using incremental improvements to stretch endurance, speed, and precision. It's a slow march, but every day brings a tiny evolution that keeps the forge alive and your hands working. Illness and injury are constant companions in a life like yours, never dramatic but always present, whispering reminders that your body is a fragile tool as well. You notice early signs of fatigue, muscle strain, or joint pain and learn to work around them. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmiths experienced chronic conditions, arthritis, tendonitis, and respiratory problems from smoke and dust, at far higher rates than peasants, and medical care was rudimentary at best. You learn to treat your body as both asset and liability. Small injuries are routine. A nicked finger, a burn on the forearm, a blister from gripping tongues too tightly. Each teaches caution and patience. You handle them without much drama, wrapping cloth, dabbing herbs, and returning to work. Joke 1: modern self-care would be amazed at how much perseverance counts as treatment in your world. Over time, these minor mishaps become badges of experience. Your hands are a map of countless small lessons, each scar a story. Serious injuries, however, carry real consequences. A deep cut, a broken finger, or a sprained wrist can halt your work entirely. You can't simply rest and wait. Villagers need nails, plows, and shoes for horses. There's no paid sick leave, no insurance. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths had more resilience or just more unavoidable suffering, but you know it's both. When serious injuries happen, they ripple through your life and the village's functioning alike. Illness works similarly. Seasonal fevers, respiratory issues from smoke inhalation, or general exhaustion can reduce efficiency. You push through minor sicknesses because survival demands it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it makes mistakes more likely, and mistakes can be expensive or dangerous. A quirky tidbitting: some blacksmiths believed that soaking in warm vinegar or rubbing herbs on sore joints could stave off fatigue or minor aches. Whether it works is unclear, but ritual often helps morale. You learn to observe your own body closely. Tension in your shoulders signals overuse. Slight swelling in your fingers warns of strain. Every ache and twinge becomes part of a silent ledger you keep, measuring limits before breaking points. Your awareness grows subtle, almost instinctive. Joke 2: if your body could talk, it would probably sigh at least twice a day. Injuries and illness shape work rhythm as well. You adapt tasks to accommodate weaknesses, lighter hammering, longer pauses, rearranged projects. Flexibility becomes a survival skill almost as important as precision. Sometimes you delegate tasks to apprentices or helpers, though this adds mental stress because mistakes made in your absence still reflect on you. Despite all this, you endure. The forge demands it, and life has no alternative. Chronic aches, minor burns, and recurring colds become part of the background, like the constant hum of the bellows or the glow of coals. They shape not just your physical body, but your understanding of labor, resilience, and the fragile balance between survival and fatigue. By acknowledging these limits, you learn to push strategically, and livelihoods, living in a state of calculated endurance that defines a lifetime at the anvil. You start noticing patterns in human behavior as clearly as you notice patterns in metal. Villagers come and go, requests repeat, complaints recur. You learn to anticipate needs before they're voiced. A mainstream historical factor, medieval blacksmiths often served as informal advisors in communities because they observed everyone, heard everything, and understood resources and capabilities intimately. Your position is paradoxical. You are central to daily life, yet mostly peripheral in social hierarchies. People depend on you, but rarely see the full extent of your labor. Children and apprentices offer early lessons in observation. You watch how they react to the forge's heat, the noise of hammer on iron, the smell of smoke. You notice which ones are patient, which are impulsive, which listen carefully. These traits shape how you assign tasks and train them. A quirky tidbit and livelihoods. Some smiths did apprentices by giving them slightly crooked nails to straighten, judging patience and dexterity in ways that were subtly psychological as well as practical. Patterns extend to trade and economy. Farmers need tools at predictable points in the season. Nobles request armor repairs before anticipated battles. Weddings, funerals, harvest festivals. They all bring spikes in demand. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths actively planned around these cycles or simply adapted reactively, but you understand them instinctively. Anticipation is survival. Anticipation saves wasted effort, wasted metal, wasted time. You notice emotional patterns too. Villagers trust consistent work but respond unpredictably to slights or perceived favoritism. Diplomacy becomes subtle art. Who gets the first horseshoe repaired? Who waits? Who receives extra attention? Your reputation carries consequences. Joke. It's like playing chess with people who don't understand the rules, but expect you to win anyway. Conflict emerges subtly. Neighboring smiths might envy your skill. Apprentices may chafe under expectations, or customers may overstep boundaries. You respond with a mix of silence, careful redirection, and occasional assertiveness. Social observation becomes as crucial as technical skill. A small misstep can echo far beyond the forge. You learn to gauge tone, timing, and reaction, all while keeping hands and attention focused on metal. Patterns in personal behavior emerge as well. You notice your own limits, preferences, and fatigue cycles. You time heavy tasks for when energy peaks, reserve repetitive or lighter work for dips, and gradually optimize your daily routine. This self-knowledge grows into a quiet confidence, a kind of internal rhythm that mirrors the forge's cycles. Joke took its productivity hacks, medieval edition, powered entirely by exhaustion and necessity. By recognizing these patterns, you also notice anomalies. Sudden drops in material quality, unusual customer requests, or shifts in weather demand immediate attention. Each anomaly teaches vigilance. Each cycle reinforces the importance of observation, memory, and anticipation. You become a master not just of iron, but of the subtle rhythms that govern labor, community, and survival. Noise becomes its own language over time. Hammer on iron, bellows pumping, coals shifting, sparks scattering. All of it carries information if you listen carefully. A mainstream historical fact. Blacksmiths relied on auditory cues to judge metal temperature, thickness, and readiness, often detecting subtle differences invisible to the eye. Your ears evolve alongside your hands, translating clans and hisses into actionable knowledge. Joke 1: your neighbors think you just make a lot of racket, but really, you're conducting an orchestra of molten metal. The forge isn't silent even when unused. Cooling iron hums faintly, coals pop quietly, and walls creak under heat expansion. You recognize these background sounds instantly. A small change, a pop in an unexpected place, a hiss that lasts too long, signals attention. It could mean the fire needs stoking, a tool is misaligned, or moisture has crept onto the metal. You adjust instinctively, often before conscious thought catches up. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen had heightened sensory awareness by necessity or through practice alone. But you suspect it's both. Noise carries social weight too. Villagers interpret hammer strikes, bellows rhythm, and even fire hissing as indicators of activity, progress, or urgency. They know when a project is nearly done or delayed. You learn to modulate sound for effect, sometimes striking harder to signal completion or softer to avoid waking nearby households. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, smiths would create a welcome clang to announce themselves to neighbors, an accidental early form of ambient notification. You've experimented with it once or twice, mostly for fun, mostly because the forge seemed lonely. Silence, in contrast, feels strange. A quiet forge suggests inactivity, mistake, or exhaustion. You grow accustomed to constant auditory feedback. Without it, you feel disconnected, almost anxious. Your mind fills gaps with imagined sparks and hammering, a phantom rhythm that lulls or unsettles depending on the night. Joke 2: it's meditation, ASMR style, minus the soft-spoken voice plus fire and danger. Over time, you develop auditory shortcuts and liehoods. The sound of a hammer hitting a specific point tells you immediately whether the metal is warped. The hiss when quenching indicates whether the temperature was right. Even the subtle resonance of a bellows pumping differently signals efficiency or obstruction. Your ears and hands coordinate seamlessly, translating sound into action, turning perception into instinct. Noise teaches patience too. You must listen for the correct moment to strike, the precise temperature to quench, and the right timing to adjust airflow. Rush the rhythm, and iron resists or breaks. Wait too long and it cools improperly. Working in harmony with sound becomes a practice in timing and mindfulness. Historians still debate whether blacksmithing was art or strictly craft. But in your daily life, it feels like both, a symphony where timing and awareness decide whether the day's work succeeds or fails. By nightfall, when sparks die down and coals cool to embers, you notice silence in a new way. It's heavy, almost tangible, yet comforting. The forge speaks less, but the lessons linger. Every clang, hiss, and hum of the day resonates in memory, shaping technique, judgment, and attention. You realize noise is not merely byproduct. It's instruction, guidance, and sometimes even reassurance. Exhaustion becomes a constant companion, more predictable than most villages. Your body works in cycles. High intensity at the forge, brief recovery while tending tools or coals, and small lulls between tasks that never last long enough to feel restful. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmiths often endured 14-hour days, especially during harvest or wartime demands, making fatigue an integral part of their skill set. You learn to recognize the subtle onset of strain, tight shoulders, sluggish swings, shallow breathing, before disaster strikes. Joke 1: modern athletes track heart rate. You track how many times you grunt per hammer swing. Fatigue is both physical and mental. You notice tiny lapses in judgment creeping in, misjudged heat, misplaced strikes, or a hand slipping on tongs. Each minor error carries risk. Over time, you develop strategies to manage it. Light tasks rotate with heavy ones. Apprentices assist more during particularly demanding stretches, and brief breaks become rituals. Small allowances carved from necessity rather than comfort. A quirky tidbit: some smiths in certain regions would chew on bitter herbs during long workdays to sharpen focus and stave off fatigue. The taste was unpleasant, but the ritual helped maintain alertness. Exhaustion teaches prioritization. You learn which projects can tolerate delay, which need immediate attention, and which can be delegated. Mistakes during fatigue are costly, both materially and reputationally. You become acutely aware that efficiency is not just speed, it's the judicious management of energy, timing, and precision. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen's productivity was constrained more by physical exhaustion or by material scarcity. But standing here in the forge, sweat-soaking tunic, you understand it's a combination of both. Sleep is elusive. Even after a long day, your body hums with muscle memory and auditory echoes, the clink of hammer on iron, the hiss of quenching. You lie down, but your hands and mind replay the day's work, revising minor mistakes or anticipating tomorrow. Joke 2. It's the original insomnia, powered by responsibility and molten metal. Exhaustion also sharpens observation. Your senses, though tired, detect subtle changes, a faint glow in coals signaling underheat, a sound in the bellows indicating blockage, a shift in the metal's response. Fatigue paradoxically teaches attentiveness, alertness in discomfort, patience in strain, and timing under pressure. You learn to pace yourself, combining muscle memory and mental acuity in a delicate balance. Despite it all, exhaustion is oddly grounding. It reminds you that your labor is real, tangible, and essential. Every ache, every sore joint, every dripping sweat bed is proof of survival, skill, and persistence. Fatigue becomes both teacher and companion, guiding your decisions, shaping your body, and reinforcing the quiet, relentless rhythm of life at the forge. Joke 3. The ultimate performance enhancer is simply not collapsing mid-strike. Your forge connects you to the wider world in ways that are both obvious and subtle. Traders, messengers, and travelers bring news materials and occasionally strange requests. A mainstream historical facting. Medieval blacksmiths were often informal nodes in trade networks, providing tools, repairs, and local intelligence to passing merchants or military expeditions. You notice patterns in arrivals. Certain wagons come with iron from distant regions, others with exotic woods or coins from far-off towns. These small links tie your work to events beyond your village. Travelers are curious, sometimes suspicious. They watch your rhythm, ask questions about your methods, and occasionally share tales of other forgers, unusual weapons, or local customs. A quirky tidbit: some smiths claimed that iron from certain regions rang differently when struck, a belief that travelers either fueled or invented to amuse themselves. You listen politely, noting what might be practical, what is amusing, and what is clearly myth. Joke 1. Your forge is part laboratory, part rumor mill, and part entertainment venue, all before lunch. Trade introduces new materials. A shipment of steel, slightly different in carbon content than your usual stock, arrives. You test it carefully, adjusting heat and hammering to compensate. Failure is costly, both in wasted material and reputation. You notice subtle shifts in the marketplacing. When steel prices rise, villagers bring iron for repair instead of new construction. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths actively influenced regional trade or simply responded to it, but you recognize your role as a small, practical participant in larger economic flows. Travelers also provide social lessons. Some attempt to haggle, others demand immediate service, and some bring goods in unexpected barter: rare spices, fabrics, or small luxuries. You weigh value, effort, and risk before agreeing. This is negotiation as survival, and it shapes skill and social awareness. Joke 2. Or every barter transaction feels like high-stakes poker, except the chips are molten metal and a customer's patience. Interaction with outsiders occasionally brings danger or challenge. A traveler might misjudge forge operations, accidentally scald themselves, or bring a complaint that spreads quickly through the village. You adapt, instructing visitors carefully while maintaining authority and safety. Experience teaches anticipation: how to handle strangers, protect your forge, and keep work flowing without distraction. Even routine interactions ripple outward. News of your skill travels beyond the village, influencing requests, commissions, and reputation. A well-crafted plowshare or sword tang might reach a distant lord, indirectly shaping local economies and social structures. The forge becomes a quiet conduit for connection, linking your hands to events, people, and places far beyond immediate awareness. You begin to understand that your labors are thread woven into a much larger tapestry. By day's end, when travelers leave and the forge settles, you feel the subtle reach of your work beyond the immediate, the hum of connection across villages, and the knowledge that even in isolation, you influence the world more than you see. The forge is both home and network, its heat and sound extending further than the eye perceives. As time passes, you notice subtle shifts in the village itself. Urban growth creeps outward, slowly changing demand, supply, and social dynamics. Streets expand, markets become busier, and more craftsmen appear, each carving out a niche. A mainstream historical fact in the late medieval period saw towns expand significantly, concentrating trade, guild activity, and specialized labor, which altered traditional village economies. You feel these changes in small but constant ways. More customers, more competition, more rules, and a growing sense that the forge exists in a larger, more complex system. Growth brings both opportunity and pressure. Towns want standardized products, faster delivery, and sometimes flashy work to showcase prosperity. You adjust routines to meet these demands, sometimes pushing hours longer than is comfortable. Joke 1. Medieval overtime comes with the bonus that everyone now expects the same turnaround for double the metal. At the same time, more competition appears as other smiths, some equally skilled, some desperate, offering services for slightly less or with novel approaches. This subtle rivalry forces vigilance, innovation, and careful reputation management. Infrastructure changes also shift material flow. Roads improve or worsen. Wagon access determines whether heavy iron shipments arrive efficiently or slowly. Markets open at predictable hours, bringing more diverse clientele but also raising expectations. You notice how the forge becomes a small node in an expanding network, reacting to factors far beyond your control. Historians still argue whether medieval artisans actively shaped urban growth or merely adapted, but from your perspective, adaptation is survival. Social dynamics shift too. Towns attract people from surrounding villages, introducing new customs, languages, or expectations. Patrons may have greater awareness of market standards, comparing your work to distant smiths. You notice subtle changes in bargaining, request, complexity, and even politeness. A quirky tidbit: some growing towns experimented with rotating guild oversight, ensuring no single blacksmith dominated local trade, an early form of anti-monopoly thinking. You navigate these changes carefully, balancing compliance and self-interest. Even urban growth reshapes apprenticeships. More young workers arrive seeking training, giving you a choice: accept more hands and maintain influence, or limit intake and risk isolation. You weigh the long-term benefits of teaching against short-term strain. Each decision affects reputation, production, and relationships. Joke 2. Apprenticeship management is basically human resource strategy, except the interns occasionally singe themselves or spill cool ash everywhere. Growth also affects work rhythm. Larger populations mean unpredictable spikes in demand, requiring flexibility. Seasonal festivals draw outsiders, adding additional pressure on production. You must anticipate patterns while keeping daily operations functional. The forge becomes both anchor and responsive hub, balancing the needs of tradition with the pressures of expansion. By nightfall, when streets quiet and markets empty, you reflect on how subtly life has shifted. The forge hasn't moved, but the world around it has stretched, adding complexity, opportunity, and occasional stress. You realize that surviving in this environment requires not just skill at the anvil, but adaptability, observation, and careful social awareness. The forge remains your center, even as the village grows, and you adapt with it, quietly resilient amidst change. Seasons continue to shape your life, but now you notice how subtle cycles intersect. Planting, harvest, and winter preparations bring bursts of frantic activity. followed by quieter periods where repair, sharpening, and minor projects dominate. A mainstream historical fact: medieval blacksmithing was tightly linked to agricultural cycles, with plowshares, house, and sickles in high demand before planting and harvest. Your work is dictated less by whim than by nature, yet within these constraints you exercise skill, judgment, and endurance. You notice how rhythm affects more than labor. Villagers become predictable in behavior, temperament, and requests. Farmers arrive with slightly anxious faces before planting, celebrants linger after festivals, and traders appear with predictable supplies. These patterns allow you to anticipate demand, plan material usage, and even schedule apprentices. Joke 1: it's like having a built-in calendar, except the holidays are terrifying if you miscalculate and run out of nails. Cycles teach patience. Not everything can be rushed. Iron must heat, metal must cool, and tasks must unfold in order. You learn to pace yourself, blending urgency with restraint. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, blacksmiths timed the tempering of iron to the phases of the moon, believing it influenced durability. Whether superstition or coincidence, following these rituals often helped enforce careful timing and slowed reckless haste. Historians still argue how seriously such practices were taken, but for you, any excuse to handle iron deliberately is welcome. You observe the village's emotional rhythm too. Seasonal pressures create stress, gossip, and occasional conflict. You adjust interactions accordingly, offering firmness, patience, or quiet distraction. Your position as the blacksmith grants subtle authority. People tolerate delays or mistakes from you more readily than from others because your labor is indispensable. This social calibration becomes second nature. Joke Twog: it's basically medieval crowd control, powered entirely by hammer swings. Cycles also remind you of mortality and continuity. Plowshares and sickles you forge now will be used months later in fields that sustain life. Weapons may lie in wait for conflict. Tools endure for generations. You are part of a repeating pattern that outlasts individual effort, where every strike is both ephemeral and permanent. Recognition or reward comes rarely, yet survival, both yours and the villagers, remains the quiet compensation. By the end of the year, the rhythms of labor, weather, economy, and human behavior coalesce into an almost meditative structure. You understand flow, timing, and adaptation at a level few notice but everyone benefits from. The forge hums with continuity, connecting past, present, and future through heat, metal, and patient labor. Over the years, you notice how time itself feels different. Days blend into weeks, weeks into seasons, and years accumulate like layers of scale on the anvil. The forge, constant yet ever-changing, becomes your measure of passage. A mainstream historical fact: blacksmiths' lives were largely defined by routine, the repetition of tasks, and mastery of skill, making temporal awareness both practical and psychological. You sense time in hammer strikes, in coals burning down, in apprentices learning and leaving, and in villagers' cycles of need. You begin to appreciate subtler aspects of life that others overlook. The way a well-forged nail glints in the sun, the faint smell of heated iron mixing with wood smoke, the rhythm of footsteps approaching your forge gate. These details anchor you. A quirky tidbit: some smiths would carve small symbols or initials into objects as a private signature, a hidden legacy in every horseshoe or plowshare. You start doing the same, embedding tiny marks for no one but yourself. Joke 1: it's like leaving Easter eggs for future archaeologists who will have no idea what a mundane life this was. Reputation and legacy become clearer in importance. Villagers remember who repaired their plow efficiently, whose horsey shoes lasted longer, or whose weapons held up in distant conflicts. You realize that skill, consistency, and integrity echo beyond the forge, even if you never leave the village yourself. Historians still argue how much personal reputation shaped medieval artisans' livelihoods versus guild oversight, but from experience it matters profoundly. Your own body carries accumulated history. Hands, shoulders, and back bear the weight of decades of labor. Minor injuries, chronic aches, and learned precision become intertwined. Fatigue, once purely negative, now doubles as wisdom. Your instincts for timing, heat, and metal are honed to near-perfect reliability. Joke tug, your muscles probably know more metallurgy than you do by now, yet you also recognize limits. Mortality, of course, looms quietly. Materials degrade, tools break, bodies tire, and no skill can entirely escape the passage of years. The forge teaches humility alongside mastery. You learn to value each successful day, each project completed, each apprentice guided, and each quiet evening when the forge cools. The life of a blacksmith is repetitive, exhausting, and often overlooked, but it also pulses with subtle victories, quiet endurance, and a rhythm that connects generations. By now, your understanding of the forge, the village, and your own life is deep and patient. You move through tasks with almost meditative focused hammering, quin shaping, and polishing, each motion precise and meaningful. A mainstream historical fact, medieval blacksmiths often reached mastery through decades of repetitive labor. Their skill measured not in speed alone, but in consistency, reliability, and subtle fineness. You notice how muscle memory blends with intuition, turning labor into something approaching art. Apprentices come and go, some learning quickly, others struggling. You teach more than technique, you impart patience, awareness, and adaptability. The forge becomes a classroom, and every tool, flame, and spark a lesson, a quirky tidbit. Some masters would deliberately give apprentices slightly flawed metal to see if they could recognize and correct errors without guidance. A test of observation and creativity. Joke 1, basically medieval QA testing, but if you fail, you get soot instead of feedback forms. Your body has its limits, but you've learned to respect and work within them. Chronic aches, blisters, and fatigue no longer feel like obstacles. They're reminders of endurance, lessons etched in flesh and memory. Historians still debate how much hardship defined craftsmanship versus skill, but for you, endurance and skill are inseparable. One cannot exist without the other. Surviving the forge is part of mastering it. Socially, your role in the village has become quiet but essential. People rely on your labor, your judgment, and your steadiness. You notice subtle shifts in reputation. Neighbors consult you about disputes. Traders recognize your reliability, and younger villagers speak of the forge with a mix of respect and curiosity. Your work connects the everyday to the extraordinary. The mundane task of shaping iron ripples outward, influencing harvests, defense, and lives you will never fully see. Joke tug, your influence comes entirely from hammering things really well. At the close of a long day, you pause and observe the forge. Coals glow softly, embers settle, and shadows dance along walls blackened with decades of smoke. You feel the weight and satisfaction of accumulated years of skill honed, mistakes endured, and countless pieces of metal transformed into utility, beauty, or protection. It is exhausting, repetitive, and sometimes thankless, yet deeply grounding. Your life, like the iron you shape, is forged slowly, patiently, and with enduring care. The forge quiets as the last coals dim, and the hum of your daily labor fades into gentle silence. Outside, the village exhales, the wind moves softly through trees, and distant animals settle into night. Your muscles, tired yet steady, remember every strike, every quinch, every small correction of metal that refused to bend. You feel the rhythm of the day lingering in your limbs, a gentle echo rather than a weight. Breathing slows, awareness softens, and the sharpness of the day dissolves into a calm hum. You notice the faint residual warmth of the forge, the smell of cooled iron, and the quiet whisper of night moving through familiar spaces. The world feels expansive, yet intimately connected. The forge, your body, the village, and even the distant trade routes are threads of a single, persistent pattern. Even in exhaustion, there is peace. Skill, patience, and endurance have carried you through repetitive hours and subtle challenges. You recognize your presence in every horseshoe, plowshare, and tool you have touched, each one a silent testament to diligence, care, and resilience. Life in this quiet rhythm, though demanding, has shaped both metal and self. As you settle, let the heat and motion of the day fade from memory. The forge rests, the village rests, you rest, muscles release, thoughts soften, and the echo of hammer and bellows becomes a gentle background cadence, a lullaby in steel and smoke. Tomorrow may bring sparks again, but for tonight there is quiet, there is stillness, and there is the steady, enduring heartbeat of a life forged with care, patience, and quiet persistence. Sleep, if it comes, is deep and deserved. Let your breath slow, your thoughts drift, and your mind drift along with the fading glow of the forge.